Nobody wants to get united. Like, what we gotta do is meet everybody on 149th Street at the bench.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the bench. Today I want to talk to you guys about how graffiti has absolutely nothing to do with hip-hop. And this is a pretty divisive topic. There's some graffiti artists who already know this, but it's not up for debate. It is a matter of historical fact. And that's what we're going to be going over today. We're going to be looking at dates, we're going to be looking at what happened at what time, and the two different histories between hip-hop and graffiti. But don't take my word for this, because countless old school New York graffiti artists have been saying this since this misinformation has been put out there. For example, let's hear Scene say it for himself.
The early days of graffiti, hip-hop didn't even exist. They would be on the layup, painting trains, listening to, let's say, Motown music, you know? So it didn't exist then.
Hip-hop came after graffiti. Graffiti had already started and began its history by the time hip-hop came around. Hip-hop is widely considered to have started around 1973 when Kool Herc threw the first hip-hop party. Once Grandmaster Flash came into the picture, you had like the holy trinity right there of hip-hop, and this is seen as some of the first historical figures of hip-hop. Once again, Coke La Rock, Afrika Bambaataa, Kool Herc, and Grandmaster Flash. Notice how none of the old school New York graffiti artists are mentioned in the foundation of hip-hop. Why? Because the two are unrelated. A lot of the graffiti artists back then didn't even like hip-hop. They listened to pretty much any other music, everything from disco to metal. Now, some of you guys may say, oh, well, what about people like KRS-One? Sure, you had some people who liked hip-hop who also liked graffiti, but for example, I like playing games, and I'm also a graffiti artist. Does that make graffiti and video games have an overlap? No. Just because you do one thing and another thing doesn't suddenly relate those two things. The confusion comes in once you go ahead and you have Style Wars. Now, I love Style Wars just as much as the next, and it's widely considered to be a must-watch movie for a lot of new graffiti artists. I've literally seen old school New York graffiti artists laugh new graffiti artists out of the room if they say they haven't seen Style Wars. But Style Wars plays a huge pivotal part in the misinformation and the spread of it, because Style Wars wasn't even supposed to be about graffiti. It was supposed to be a breakdancing documentary. However, they couldn't get enough content, so what do? Jam graffiti along with the breakdancing, and of course breakdancing does have a role to play in hip-hop, and boom, there you go. The misconception starts.
As an element of hip-hop. But what do you think about that?
Firstly, you know how all this got melted together?
How?
Do you
How's
have any
that?
clue? Henry Chalfant, before he did Style Wars, it was supposed to be a documentary on breakdance.
Okay.
What happened was, one, there wasn't enough material to do a complete documentary on it. And two, they had problems with the people that they were going to do the breakdancing thing at. So they thought about combining breaking, rapping, and graffiti together. And once they put in a documentary, it was packaged and sold to Europe first as of one big package. It never belonged together. Okay? I'm sorry to say.
Now, I did do research into hip-hop's history, and I did, of course, obviously know graffiti's history. So we look at both histories, we can see that hip-hop never mentions any pivotal or legendary or important graffiti artists in hip-hop's history. And graffiti never mentions any important hip-hop figures in graffiti's history. Why? Because when we take a look at graffiti's history, we can see graffiti started before hip-hop. Now, there's a large amount of debate as to when graffiti started, because you can go ahead and say it started old school New York in the late 1960s to early 70s, or you can go ahead and say Cornbread started it in the mid 60s, or you have the people who go ahead and say the group of people in New York who wrote Bird Lives started graffiti, and then you have the people who go ahead and say graffiti started in ancient Rome, where fine art was reserved for the rich and the poor people couldn't afford it. So what do? They made up tag names, took whatever paint they could scrap together, and even took rocks and illegally wrote their names on walls, and even went as far as to cross one another out, which sounds a lot like graffiti if you ask me. So there's a lot of debate as to when graffiti started, but all of those I just mentioned are before hip-hop even started. So that's evidence enough that, once again, hip-hop has nothing to do with graffiti, and graffiti has nothing to do with hip-hop. It's important for graffiti to not have any more misinformation than it already does, because there is a ton of misinformation out there. And you gotta understand, like, we're still in the infancy of graffiti. Graffiti is less than a century old, and it's not going anywhere. Give it 100 years, 200 years, 300 years, they're gonna look back at these times for reference to figure out the history. So it is pretty important that we go ahead and set it straight that hip-hop has nothing to do with graffiti. I'm glad that old school graffiti artists also came out and said this, because it lends a lot more credibility than just someone like me, someone who's a nobody, going ahead and saying this. Because I've been saying it for the past decade and a half, and people thought I was crazy, people thought I was stupid, but here we have genuine facts because of the dates, and we have credible graffiti artists coming out and saying the same thing I've been saying. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of today's video. Hopefully you guys enjoyed it, hopefully you guys learned something, and hopefully we can spread this information out there. We can go ahead and inform graffiti artists about the true history and the true culture of graffiti, separate from hip-hop. Because at the end of the day, once again, we have to get rid of the misinformation in graffiti. There is way too much of it. So go ahead and take this video, put it on the graffiti forums you hang out in, go ahead and share it with your crew, share it with your friends. That way we can do just that, spread information. Anyway, for those of you guys who are new here, for those of you guys who are first-time viewers, feel free to subscribe and come out with informational graffiti videos on a weekly basis. I hope to see you guys in the next one, but until then, peace.